Good morning. 2022 was indeed an eventful year in which we covered the 20th Communist Party Congress in China, the G20 meeting in Bali, and the US midterm elections, which saw a quite extraordinary outcome. But there was one meeting that took place in 2022, a meeting between Xi Jinping, the Chinese leader, and Dimitri Medvedev, the deputy chairman of the Russian National Security Council and leader of the United Russia Party, that I'd like to talk about, that I'd like to dwell on, in fact, and use to build a picture of where we are geopolitically now, and geoeconomically, if you like, in 2023. The Chinese leader invited Medvedev to Beijing and seemed anxious about the meeting. And the purpose was that he wanted to impart a message of importance. It is this imparted message which gives an insight into how the Chinese leader views the so-called struggle, the leitmotif of what Xi calls the new era, in which the new development concept, that of the dual circulation economy, is to be implemented. This transformation of China from an export-led growth economy into a internal demand-led growth economy. In this struggle, Xi obviously sees many or most of the obstacles, in fact, as being caused by the United States on the way to achieving his aims, or the aims of the Chinese people, in his view. And to overcome these obstacles, Xi prioritizes what he calls political solutions. So the invitation that Xi proffered to Medvedev came in reaction to something that Medvedev had posted on his Telegram account on the 27th of September, where he said that it is conceivable that Russia is forced to use the most fearsome weapon against the Ukrainian regime, which had committed a large-scale act of aggression that is dangerous for the very existence of our state. Logically, anything that threatens the very existence of the Russian state under its nuclear doctrine, which is publicly available, would justify the use of its most fearsome weapon. This needn't have been spelled out. If you respond in this way to Ukrainian taunts, then the question arises as to what exactly might constitute a threat to the very existence of the Russian state. For instance, one might ask, would such an outcome be identical with, say, a fall in the Putin government? Medvedev, who was once considered the leader of the liberal wing of the Russian elite, the Russian political elite, has, since joining the Russian National Security Council, turned decidedly hawkish. But this didn't mean he had to make this statement. It was the very first time anyone from the Russian leadership has actually referred in such a way to the use of nuclear weapons, although the Biden administration had been trying very hard to put words to this effect into the mouth of one or other of Russia's leaders for some time. It was a mistake for Medvedev to thus oblige his antagonists. Washington has been using the tactic of trying to paint Russia as a rogue state, both to sustain popularity for the war and also to try to destabilize its relationship with China, or Russia's relationship with China. China, meanwhile, is being supportive of Russian arguments for waging the war in Ukraine, ever emphasizing its alliance with Russia, but it has always been cautious of actually appearing to support the war as such, insisting that the problem cannot be resolved militarily. A week after Medvedev's statement on November the 5th, the Biden administration began to push the Ukrainian leader, Zelensky, to become more accommodative of the idea of peace talks with Russia. This would serve the purpose of dealing with Ukraine fatigue amongst US representatives in Congress and amongst US allies in Europe. Zelensky's decree prohibiting himself from ever negotiating with Russia so long as Putin was its president was clearly absurd. Among other things, however, well, not among other things, the most important thing was that the vast US military budget for fiscal year 2023 was going through Congress, and the economy depended crucially on this package, and it had to be passed urgently before the Republican Party took over the leadership of the House of Representatives in January this month, as we speak, in fact. So at that time, early November, in fact on November the 4th, Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, went to Beijing to visit Xi Jinping. I bring that up because during that meeting, Xi, out of the blue, decided to bring up the question of nuclear weapons and their use in Ukraine. It wasn't something that was at all relevant to the discussions with the German Chancellor, which were mainly about commercial ties. Nevertheless, Xi announced in the meeting that the international community should support all efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis and call on relevant parties to remain rational and exercise restraint, start direct engagement as quickly as possible, and create conditions for the resumption of talks, oppose the threat or use of nuclear weapons, advocate that nuclear weapons cannot be used and that nuclear wars must not be fought, and prevent a nuclear crisis in Eurasia. Xi couldn't have been clearer on the subject of not using nuclear weapons. After making this statement, he invited Medvedev to Beijing, and the meeting was headlined the Xi-Medvedev meeting, which highlights bilateral ties, could promote more profound and actual progress of peace talks. The meeting clearly was going to be about Ukraine. Medvedev, as leader of the United Russia Party, in the discussions committed his party to backing agreements that the Chinese and Russian leaders had previously made in regard to issues to do with the economy, trade, energy and agriculture. But Medvedev didn't really have to travel all the way to Beijing to say all of this. The urgent question, the question that this meeting was about, was the security question regarding statements about using nuclear weapons in Ukraine, which had caused extreme anxiety in Beijing. Furthermore, Xi's meticulous approach to messaging, which is often referred to as ideology in discussions of Chinese policymaking, required Medvedev's presence in Beijing in person to settle the matter. And on this subject, Xi said in the readout that China decides its position and policy based on the merits of the matter concerned, upholds objectivity and fairness, and actively promotes peace talks, adding that hopefully relevant parties will remain rational and exercise restraint, carry out comprehensive dialogue, and address joint security concerns through political means. So Medvedev, especially in his capacity as National Security Council Vice Chairman under Putin, needed to remain rational and exercise restraint. Furthermore, the solution to the problem in Ukraine was pointed out as being a joint decision. Russia was not alone in this. It was about the problem of security in Eurasia. And it was a political issue. Political, mind you, not diplomatic. So all the talk about peace negotiations is not the point. The point is how to resolve a particular situation without reverting to war or minimizing the nature of the war as it is being fought. Russian relations have always been important to China, but they've had their ups and downs, obviously. Going back to Mao Zedong, immediately after Mao established the People's Republic, he went to Moscow, February 1950, and signed an alliance with the Soviet Union. The symbolism attached to this relationship continues to this day. No sooner was Xi confirmed in his position as state president of China, which is the last of 4 different positions that Xi holds as Chinese leader. This was confirmed in February 2013. He went straight to Moscow to confirm his friendship with Vladimir Putin and China's alliance with Russia. But even as ties between the two countries have always been cherished by Chinese leaders, there's also been times of ideological disagreement. For instance, when Mao disagreed with Nikita Khrushchev in 1956 over Khrushchev's new policy of peaceful coexistence with the West. We have in the 1980s, Deng Xiaoping was very critical of Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms, calling them idiotic. This disagreement with Russia was less serious than that, but more serious in the sense that it involved nuclear weapons. And it was so serious enough to warrant immediate attention. The Chinese leadership has been apprised of progress on the Ukraine front every step of the way by Russia. On February the 4th, even before Russia's invasion of eastern Ukraine, immediately after the Winter Olympics, Xi Jinping and Putin announced a friendship without limits, an unusual variation on the notion of an alliance, but perhaps reflecting the nature of what was about to happen. It hadn't escaped the Chinese leadership that NATO expansion and the blank unresponsiveness of the United States to the numerous diplomatic overtures by Russia ever since Medvedev's proposals for a European security architecture in 2008 hadn't escaped in the Chinese leadership that all this had now built up and finally caused Russia to act, to defang what was effectively a gun platform. And this term is I take from the journalist John Helmer, who uses it to describe the way Ukraine was developed as a military base by the United States targeting Russia. The Western commentariat called Russia's attack an invasion of Ukraine, ignoring Russia's own terms for what it called a special military operation. This enabled the Western media to build the straw man that would later enable descriptions of any achievements short of total occupation and pacification of Ukraine as a sort of total failure, as a series of misjudgments, as a disastrous performance by the Russian military and so on. If Russia got its way on the ground, at least there would be a PR victory in the imaginary of the media sphere. Anyway, all of this hides what is really going on the ground, namely that Russia announced its intention of rescuing the self-declared Russian-speaking republics of the Donbass, what was left of their populations after many of the most productive elements had already gone to China, to Russia, to work, to live and work. But the main aim behind that of the special military operation was to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. In other words, to nobble the Golan platform that the United States had spent 8 years building. And the extent to which Ukraine was to become a wasteland depended on the lengths to which the United States was prepared to go to try and destabilize Russia. As things went on and the Ukrainian army was depleted, other NATO forces donned Ukrainian uniform, especially Polish and Romanian forces. And as things went on further, and as special forces began to attack Russian targets, so Russia upped the ante with widespread missile attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Further on, in retaliation, we see drone attacks targeted on targets in Russia's interior in retaliation for the missile attacks. And this in turn led to Medvedev's statement about nuclear weapons. So it is at this point that Xi Jinping pulled Medvedev up short. And the urgent advice he gave was that the solution was not going to be military to any of this. It was going to be political, and it had to be a joint decision. Before going on to see how Russian policy on Ukraine would converge with Chinese policy, let us understand how Xi Jinping understands the Maoist concept of political solutions. Following Mao, Xi's own thinking has always sublimated the diplomatic and the military to the purely political. He was resoundingly successful at the 20th Congress of the Communist Party this last October. He not only secured an unprecedented third term as leader, but he filled the Politburo with his loyalists, and as was the case in 2017, he didn't appoint a successor, so ensuring a fourth term for himself by default. But given this undeniable position of strength, his subsequent statement on the Taiwanese question was unusually restrained. In his main speech at the Congress, he said that he wanted peaceful reunification, and this remained the best way to realize reunification across the Taiwan Strait, adding that Beijing has maintained the initiative and the ability to steer in cross-strait relations. In the most interesting part of his commentary, he said that he understood himself to have put forward an overall policy framework for resolving the Taiwan question. An oddly confident statement, given the confused nature of the relationship with the United States over the future of the island. US constructive ambiguity marries, at least lip service being paid to the one China policy, together with arming Taiwan to the teeth, ostensibly for defensive purposes. Furthermore, the confusion was added by Biden when he said that the United States would come to Taiwan's defense if China launched what he called an unprecedented attack. Nevertheless, given that there's no mutual defense treaty between the United States and Taiwan, and that there is not likely to be, there's no binding commitment for such rescue, for such intervention. So in all this smoke, Xi ascribes to himself, says that he has found a solution. So what does he mean when he says he has a policy to resolve this difficult issue? If we look at the Maoist philosophy regarding political resolutions to problems, we recognize immediately that it is about changing facts on the ground. Building islands across the China Sea, for instance, is the quintessential way of changing facts on the ground, or in this case in the sea. The reaction to Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan on the 22nd of August is another case in point. The People Liberation Army's immense effort of military power projection blocked access to the island for several days after Pelosi's visit, and involved the unprecedented and provocative act of firing missiles over the island as part of training exercises. Subsequently, in the Taiwanese November elections, the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, the DPP, fared extremely badly, and its leader, Tsai Ing-wen, had to resign. So that the Taiwanese people saw Pelosi's visit as a mistake, invoking China's ire unnecessarily, was a vindication of Xi's tactics. And at the same time, he gave a physical demonstration of the extraordinary increase in China's military power that has occurred in recent years, in case people hadn't noticed. There's an even more interesting and indeed consequential example of a political solution. The so-called Wolf Amendment, passed by the US Congress in April 2011, banned NASA, the National Aeronautics Space Agency of the United States, from engaging in bilateral agreements in coordination with China. This meant that China was the only country in the world that was officially stopped from participating in the International Space Station. This amendment to a law was introduced into the US federal budget of 2011 by then Republican Representative Frank Wolf from Virginia. And it was done so on the basis, among other things, that the Chinese were deemed untrustworthy in regard to theft of advanced technology. And the amendment kept on being renewed year after year. Wolf participated in the debates in the 1990s under the Clinton administration that pitted supporters like him of the position of Madeleine Albright at the State Department, who sought to sanction China for human rights abuses, against the corporate interests which backed Stephen Rubin at the US Treasury, who was going for pushing China to join the World Trade Organization and ignoring anything to do with Chinese domestic politics. The net effect of the ban was that China built its own space station, Tiangong, assembled between April 2021 and December 2023. With the International Space Station now being decommissioned, Tiangong, as we speak, is the only game in town. Meanwhile, China's Mars mission, Tianwen-1, was launched in July 2020. This particular project stunned the space community when it was discovered that the orbiter included a lander and a rover, both of which have now been deployed on the surface of the Red Planet. The Chinese Space Agency did in one go what it took years for NASA to do in several stages. With all the sensitivities aroused by the demonization of everything Russian in the mainstream Western media in recent months, China's undoubted expertise in space is now being increasingly allied to that of China, and this is becoming a cause of major concern in American space circles. We now see NASA's chief, Bill Nelson, apoplectic at the prospect of the Sino-Russian joint construction of a moon base. So facts on the ground and in the sea extend now into space, to our moon and to the planets. What space provides to China as a nation is a new frontier, which is no longer seen as a metaphor, but is increasingly being understood literally. Space will provide the most incrementally significant scope for the kind of political solutions she has in mind. This is extremely important, and I will add a general point here. Albeit currently marginal in terms of the political consciousness of our species, space will likely provide the Archimedean point from which a new planetary order will arise from the ashes of our current decaying neoliberal world disorder, which I've been discussing throughout my videos. A new order that will increasingly view climate change and the collapse of biodiversity from a geoengineering perspective. This is because our survival will require more radical steps to be taken on a planetary scale than the ones currently being undermined by the corporate forces that continue to control policy in Western countries. That is, unless we get a miracle and we see some kind of fundamental political change and reform in the United States, the United Kingdom, and in Europe. Anyway, political solutions are the way forward in Xi Jinping's interpretation of the Maoist struggle to implement the new development concept. War, as such, is disruptive and has to be avoided in this context. Although the dual circulation economy, which the national development, the new development concept establishes in the new era, is much more resilient than the export-led economy of the past, because clearly its inner core depends essentially on inner consumer demand-led growth, rather than being dependent on external markets. Nevertheless, war is disruptive of achieving the outer circle of the dual circulation economy. And to the extent that war is unavoidable, like in the case of Ukraine, it has to be rigidly contained. So in this context, we see, and in these discussions, we see a decided shift in the tempo and direction of Russian military activity in Ukraine. So we're talking here again of new facts on the ground, making their presence strongly felt, shaping a new political solution, one with extensive geoeconomic implications. Specifically, in terms of the details of what's happening, we've seen a withdrawal of Russian forces from the northern part of Kherson province, above the Dnieper River. And since then, 3 lines of fortifications have been built across the Zaporizhia region, which extending from the natural barrier that the Dnieper River offers, the Dnieper River in the Kherson region offers, extending all the way to the southern part of Donbass, where now the heaviest fighting is automatically being concentrated. And from the northern part of Donbass, we see fortifications starting to be built, or largely finished being built, from the northern part of Donbass across Russia's western borders with the rump of Ukraine over the Kharkov region. And allied with these fortifications, you see a massive recruitment of 300,000 reservists, followed now by an additional decision to increase professional Russian forces by 500,000 personnel. So if all these defensive actions are anything to go by, this expansion of the Russian army is to be, or the Russian armed forces, is to be interpreted not as preparation for an invasion, but as preparation for a deterrent force. So we see the commitment of the United States in the current negotiations over the vast new military budget in Congress, commitment to the United States to keep the war going for as long as it takes. And this means that impenetrable defenses have to be built along the Russian border with the rump of Ukraine, and what is necessary to man these defenses along this really long frontier is a very large supply of personnel that is large enough to allow constant rotation. Associated with that, we have the Belarusian military being integrated into the Russian military. Belarus, in fact, it would appear, is being turned into a gun platform targeted at Europe in somewhat the same way, not entirely the same way, but in somewhat the same way that Ukraine had been prepared by the United States. And with all of this, we can conclude that the curtain of steel falls across Eastern Europe now, one that makes for a rather final and hard Russian pivot to Asia. And this has two fundamental geoeconomic implications. The first is that the Russian landmass, its economy and resources, are now firmly coupled to the Chinese project. The New Year's message broadcast by Xi Jinping on the 30th of December tells us that under the guidance of both President Putin and Xi himself, the China-Russia Comprehensive Strategic Partnership of Coordination for a New Era has grown more mature and resilient. So between the 21st of December and the 30th of December, Xi's anxiety has been addressed, and Russian acquiescence to China's messaging has led to a final meeting of minds. We have to remember, in terms of messaging, this is really important, because if the strategic partnership with Russia is said in this message to be a feature of the new era, it then becomes a foundation stone of the new development concept, the dual circulation economy. Russia is thus firmly on a Chinese orbit and integral to the future that Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party is building for the Chinese nation. The second point, second fundamental geoeconomic point, is that with Russia's reconfiguration of its defense posture, the onus of committing to the war in Ukraine for as long as it takes, in Biden's words, now falls squarely on the shoulders of the United States. The Biden administration is drowning in contradictions. Inflation is raging, due largely to the dislocations and sectoral price misalignments caused by war and the aggressive U.S. sanctions against China and against Russia, and China for that matter. The sanctions we discussed at Russia, and I'll come back to the sanctions being aimed at China in a minute. The U.S. Federal Reserve is responding to developments in a typically inappropriate way. U.S. political institutions are very hard to reform, and policy is inevitably, always, about applying the third best option. The Fed is now raising interest rates because it wants to reduce aggregate demand in order to quell inflation. But this will only ensure that the recession that is underway now will turn into a depression unless we get some backtracking on the policy soon. And with such unmitigated disaster looming on the horizon, the only solution that the White House seems to be able to pursue is to activate the only welfare mechanism the US Congress has, which automatically carries the controlling vote of the corporate sector, and to embark on this on an epic scale is to pass a massive military budget. This military budget, $858 billion, is unbelievable, unprecedented in size. It seems to have passed in the nick of time before the January takeover of the House by the the Republicans. Zelensky's promotional tour, the round trip on Air Force One, added the sort of celebrity gloss to the whole thing. The news channels depicted his arrival as the second coming of Churchill, for heaven's sakes. Anyway, Biden's, as long as it takes strategy, does promise that down the road we'll see $1 trillion military budgets. An interesting commentary on how all this works. It came from no less than Oliver North, the former Reagan administration official who was convicted for lying to Congress about the Iran-Contra scandal. We've all heard about Senator Lindsey Graham's comment about the need to fight the Ukraine war to the last Ukrainian, but North's version, which was broadcast on Fox News in this current period, is more enlightening in that he compares fighting in Ukraine to what Ronald Reagan did back in the 80s with the death squads in Central America and the jihadis in Afghanistan. North said that all those people were willing, in his words, as Ukrainian people are today, to use their blood and our bullets. And he stressed the most important point, namely that most of the money in the military budget used for all of this is spent here in the United States on weapons contractors. I think we've heard enough about that. Anyway, I mentioned the sanctions on China, and there is a long-standing technology war with China, which the Biden administration continues to mishandle by relying on extraterritorial and unilateral actions to harm Chinese objectives. This policy had previously been restricted to the military sector, but the announcement by Jake Sullivan, the White House National Security Advisor, this September changed this policy. It seems to be wanting to lead to ensure as large a lead as possible in whole technology areas in regard to advanced chip production and supercomputing. This effectively radically ups the ante on the question of the technology war. The US used extraterritorial controls to deny the Chinese telecommunications firm Huawei access to the global chip supply in 2019, and this actually did stop Huawei's expansion. Applying sanctions and export controls in this way now to whole technology ecosystems will create a far greater shock to supply chains than those actions targeting Huawei. In the interrelated world of technology, such actions only promise chaos. We saw how inflation was a consequence of such actions was the consequence of supply chain disruptions when shortages in chip supply affected the auto sector, and we saw skyrocketing used car prices occurring as the production of new cars plummeted. These are just the types of short-term consequences. Structural, medium, and long-term effects will additionally work their way through the system as well, because firms will necessarily change production methods and strategy in reaction to how sanctions impact their bottom line. If the establishment of a factory in the advanced chip and supercomputing sectors can cost billions, up to $20 billion, and take an enormously long time to acquire all the skills to achieve effective production, sanctions will clearly put China to a disadvantage in the short term. But firms of this size and complexity, when subjected to sanctions, also become vulnerable, given their very high levels of investment and their commitments. In my last video, I mentioned the problems that the Dutch firm Advanced Semiconductor Materials Lithography, ASML, was having in this regard. And if US chip equipment manufacturers, the so-called tooling companies, are forced to leave China because of action by the United States, this will radically impact their bottom line and lead to reductions in investment and innovation globally. We saw this happening in the 2000s when the United States unilaterally imposed strict controls on satellite exports to China. But if there are short-term effects on China, these will dissipate as the supply chain will shift to include alternative suppliers lured by the enormous profits that a powerful actor like China can promise. Political solutions can be sought in a cohesive manner, and this is the ultimate answer in China to these challenges, is that political solutions can be sought in planning shifts in both product design and production methods that can see whole new approaches to these technology sectors. In sum, we can only say that the Biden administration and the US State Department are pursuing policies in the same knee-jerk, directionless manner of all administrations ever since Richard Nixon, believing in the sheer power of empire in of itself will resolve contradictions without the need for further thought and planning. In that sense, they resemble the court in the apocryphal tale of King Canute, the ephemeral emperor of the North Sea, who are seen chattering mindlessly and egging their hapless leader on, whilst ridiculously enthroned on the beach opposite the sea, egging him on to resist the incoming tide. So in China, this decaying neoliberal empire now meets the force of nature. All this is not intended as a morality tale, not at all, but one that shows a path opening up for humanity out of the airless cul-de-sac of hegemonic monopoly that the current system represents, opening up into new spaces whose horizons are fast being deconstructed and rebuilt through new primal geopolitical competitive forces. The challenges being faced on multiple scales promise to drive our path-dependent economies down so far unforeseen trajectories. It is a tale, furthermore, that portends especially of the bankruptcy and demise of the American political economy of war, which has devised under the conditions faced by the Truman administration in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that might ultimately have led humanity to its current pass, but having been retreaded at least 3 times since, doesn't seem to be able any longer to get purchase on the events of this new world. I have posted an article about this on my website, and you will find in the notes below the link to the article. And if there are any issues or questions that people would like to raise on this subject, I've also added my email address for correspondence. Thank you very much for listening.